Hello and welcome back to Chitheads. My name is Khalid and I am one of the learning navigators at Embodied Philosophy. We have a subversive episode today with Bihani Sarkar, who is a Calcutta-born, Oxford-educated scholar of classical Sanskrit literature and pre-modern Indian history and religious traditions. Bahani is a historian of early Indian politics, religions, and literature between the 2nd and 15th centuries CE. She is lecturer in Comparative Non-Western Thought at Lancaster University and formerly a departmental lecturer in Sanskrit at Oriental Institute, University of Oxford. Bahani has researched and taught in universities in the UK and in Europe. Her teaching goal is to enable everyone access to early Indian Sanskrit texts and traditions in the original language, regardless of ability or prior knowledge, and to think about them in critical, modern, and exciting ways. She has authored the book Classical Sanskrit Tragedy, The Concept of Suffering and Pathos in Medieval India. In this episode, Bahani and Jacob discuss the study of Sanskrit unmotivated by any kind of political ideology, marginalized voices in the study of Sanskrit, and Śākta as a homegrown feminist tradition inspiring and emancipating Indian women. We hope you enjoy.
Tell me about Lancaster. How has it been? How has it been different from your experience at Oxford? I'm sure it's a different vibe. Tell me a little bit about how things are going.
Well, thank you, Jacob, for kind of asking me to the podcast, and it's so nice to see you again after, gosh, it's been more than a year now.
It's been a year. Yeah, for those that are listening, this is a special interview because it's with Bihani Sarkar, who was actually my teacher at Oxford, one of the lecturers there while I was studying to do my MPhil on the first year in classical Indian religion, which was also a program you did many years ago.
Indeed, I did, yes.
Not really so many in the grand scheme of things, because we're actually the same age, I discovered, when we were when you were studying, which is always an interesting experience when you go to university again, and then suddenly your teachers are your age, they're your peers in some sense, maybe not academically, but certainly in sort of stage of life. I was mentioning to Bahani before we started that this is the first personal, academic teacher I've had who I've interviewed on Chitheads. So it's a special experience for me. And Bahani was an amazing kind of shepherdess of the program. You really were the heart of the MPhil program that year. And many of us talked about how necessary you were to really give us some direction and make us feel supported in a program that can feel a little bit cold perhaps and not super warm and nurturing, and you really brought a nurturing quality to it. So I still have very fond memories of you, and I'm really excited to chat.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That's so nice. Thanks. I mean, Jacob, you were certainly, I'm not exaggerating here, you were certainly one of the nicest students that I was teaching, and it was just so nice to have you come round to the readings and the tutorials, because I think those sessions landed up being a bit like what I think this podcast would become like, just a rich conversation, and deep conversation.
Yeah, but it wasn't always like that, was it? What do you think were the limits to getting to that place?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there were different types of classes that we had there. There were classes that were focused specifically on reading texts, in which there was very much, this is an incorrect sentence. You've interpreted or you've translated this sentence incorrectly, and this is the right sentence. So there's very much something that's a bit strict and yes and no kind of a class like that. And then there were other types of classes where we would just sit and talk, and you'd bring over your essays and we talk through the essays. And I remember even during the readings, you bringing up some really pertinent questions, which I think took the readings to a totally different level. And I also remember very, very fondly the practice sessions that we had before the exams. And I think those were special because we really bonded over vulnerabilities, because you were coming to me from a position of needing help with something. And that reminded me of how I was for much of my time as a student, needing help with my Sanskrit. And when you come with that openness and vulnerability, you bond in a different way, because that just, I think my little mommy vibe just goes off. I can't resist that. You need my help, I will help you.
Well, I think that stands out for everybody as a unique quality that you have. And I'm sure you're continuing to bring that to Lancaster as well. So how has Lancaster been? How has it been different from what you've been experiencing as a teacher so far?
I mean, I don't even know where to start. I joined Lancaster last year, but it feels like, gosh, I've lived a lifetime in this 1 year. In terms of teaching, it's very different. It's not Sanskrit text anymore. It's more religious and philosophical and historical modules. So courses designed around religious and historical topics. I'm teaching 2 modules currently that I designed. One which is called Religion and Politics of South Asia, the Power of the Past, and the other which is called Wild Asian Goddesses, Transgression and Power in South and Southeast Asia. The first one, which is what I'm teaching right now, which is Religion and Politics, the Power of the Past, we look at how religion and politics overlaps in South Asia, how it's kind of not very helpful to think of religion and politics sometimes as 2 differentiated domains. So topics like sacred kingship, both in Islam and in Hinduism, topics like ritual and power. I think maybe we did that topic. I'm not quite sure if we did that topic, but ritual and power is something which looks at how ritual is the domain in which sovereign power is created and the power of the ruler is performed. So those kinds of topics. And we're also going to look at post-colonial identity and how heritage and what role heritage can play in defining post-colonial identity. So that's very different from what I taught in Sanskrit.
Yeah.
And the Wild Asian Goddesses really looks at goddesses from South and Southeast Asia and studies them in relation to feminist theory, particularly feminist theory from Black and Islamic feminisms. In fact, there's a whole separate teaching element which will focus on comparative feminisms. And I'm really excited about that because I'm thinking about feminism and heroines in Sanskrit literature a lot these days. I'm going to be writing about it as well. So that's where I am at now. You've caught me at an exciting place.
Yeah, much more exciting, I would say, than sometimes what's happening at Oxford, which I feel like is a more limited theoretical framework. It sounds like you're really kind of expanding a bit more into, drawing on greater other theoretical frameworks like feminism in order to situate your work in Sanskrit. So it's sort of less this kind of classical philological approach, whatever that is, with all of its more or less limitations, and broadening it to sort of a more multidisciplinary kind of mode.
Yes, but certainly the reading the primary sources always anchors that for me.
Yeah.
Because I think being able to confront the historical sources without the filter of translation is something that is empowering, because I don't have other voices interpreting those sources to me. I am the first witness in a way of it without any intermediary. So I always bring that forward in my classes, that, it's direct access to the language. And a lot of this I'm thinking now in relation to a very powerful post-colonial thinker called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's a Black philosopher, and he argues in his Decolonizing the Mind that really reclaiming post-colonial identity, and this is in relation to African identity, is to go back to African languages, which have been systematically expunged and decimated by the brutality of colonialism. So going back to your primary voice, your mother tongue, is actually clawing back that identity which you've lost. So in a way, for me, my journey into Sanskrit was coming back or understanding the source of my language and my mother tongue more. And of course, I'm sure there are problems with this, which you're going to raise as well. But because, you know, as you said, I think you mentioned in your email that there is this reactive trend in amongst academic thinkers that say that, well, you're going native, quote unquote, but by going native, you're also somehow endorsing a very right-wing, fundamentalist, non-liberal idea and ideology. Now, I mean, again, the way I think about it is going back to heritage. Sorry, I'm kind of chattering on without.
No, it's very interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, why don't I'll situate your question a little bit and kind of give some a little further backdrop just to add to what you're saying. Yeah, the point I was sort of interested in talking to you about, and you've said a lot of interesting things that I feel like I have some questions about. So, well, but one of the things, we'll just go straight into it, even though I usually save the politics towards the end, but why not discuss it at the beginning? It'll keep people listening. Is that there is, on the one hand, what's interesting about what you're saying is that there is this sense in which to study Sanskrit and to go to the source text of Sanskrit is in a way coming home, like you're saying, for yourself as a South Asian person. And in that sense, there's a decolonialist element to that, right? To go to your mother tongue, as you say. And then there is this kind of other argument, which is pointing out that actually the emphasis on Sanskrit is in a way perpetuating Brahminical orthodoxy and supremacy in the region. And what these more polemical thinkers say we should be doing is we should be, in some sense, focusing more on elevating or platforming Dravidian languages, other Indian languages that are not Dravidian or Sanskritic, because by focusing on Sanskrit as sort of the primary original language of India, we in a sense marginalize some of these, other cultures, other people who lived in the region. So I guess, with that, with those two kind of perspectives in mind, how would you, situate your own perspective in relation to that? And also, do you think, I'm curious, do you think that the point about the other languages of India is a bit overstated when we look at, because it seems like, to me, there are tons of there's so much work to do in Sanskrit alone, right? There's so much literature. And yes, there's literature in these other languages, but when we do proportionally, when we look at the literature and the philosophy that has yet to be translated, there is no comparison in terms of what is left unworked on, untranslated, undiscovered. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, so I'll take the two aspects of the questions.
Yeah, go for it.
One was, I guess, about the whether learning Sanskrit or whether studying Sanskrit furthers Brahminical discourses and Brahminical orthodox thinkings. So that was the first one. And the second one was about regional languages and marginalization of regional languages in favor of Sanskrit. So I'll take the first one. So,
Yes.
so there is a bigger political context that's very important to draw out, which is that in the past few years, and particularly now, India has been governed by a right-wing Hindu nationalist party, and they endorse a particular kind of ideology, a political ideology that claims to interpret true Hinduism, and I put true within quotation marks, which is basically their interpretation of what Hinduism should be like.
Mhm.
And within this agenda, they also appropriate Sanskrit. So because Sanskrit is the language of all the ancient scriptures, they see any kind of study of Sanskrit, or they take up the study of Sanskrit as part of the Hindutva agenda.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on right now. And regardless to say, like a lot of contemporary Indians are very frightened by that, because the India that I grew up was diverse. There are many, many different voices. There are many different religious traditions. India is kaleidoscopic culturally and religiously, and that's how I've always known India. So the perpetuation of a monolithic identity that claims to be authentic, to me, is false. It's patently false. So you can understand that in the context of Sanskrit being appropriated by right-wing agendas, you can understand the reactive trend in academia that somehow views study of Sanskrit with suspicion, because they see in any kind of study of Sanskrit that fundamentalist Brahminical agenda at work. Now, that's why I found it so easy to study. I mean, I found it easier to study Sanskrit far away in rural Lancaster, where I study Sanskrit as a scholar does, purely for the love of the language and actually purely out of curiosity. I'm not studying Sanskrit out of any political agenda. The only agenda that I think it serves is a romantic one for myself, which which is to understand a different world and to inhabit a different world. So that's the context in which the reactive trend is coming up. Now, studying Sanskrit or studying some Sanskrit literature may be a furthering of Brahminical discourse, because say you're studying things like, or reading or elaborating on things like the Dharma Shastra, which given that they're Hindu legal works, do further a Brahminical agenda. So say if you study really hardline things like that, maybe you are furthering an orthodox agenda. But say, like me, you study literature from marginal traditions like goddess traditions which incorporate a lot of subversive acts that defy Brahminical orthodox thinking concerning purity, then how can you say I'm furthering Brahminical orthodoxy? Goddess traditions actually defy Brahminical orthodoxy. So that's my answer to the first part of the question, is that Sanskrit texts in Sanskrit can cover a whole lot of things, not just Brahminical discourse. And also, if you love poetry and literature, which is really my first love, the study of literature, I mean, are you furthering elitist discourse by studying poetry? Is, then you'd say that, studying Latin poetry would further some kind of Latin discourse. I mean, I study poetry because I love poetry. I love literature. So Sanskrit is a broad umbrella. Lots of things can be covered in it.
Yeah.
With the second part, which is regional languages, so my first love is really not Sanskrit, it's Bengali, which is my mother tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, my whole journey into Sanskrit was through Bengali. It was by reading a very important Bengali writer called Bankim Chandra, who writes a very rich Sanskritic Bengali prose. It was that was my first window into the richness of the Sanskrit language. It was Bankim's use of these beautiful long compounds which are padded with description that was so Sanskritic that excited my interest in Sanskrit prose, which was where Bankim was drawing his style from. So my journey into Sanskrit was through Bengali. And I hope that in doing Sanskrit, at some point in my life, I will come back to my mother tongue, Bengali. Because one day, I hope I'm able to write beautiful pieces of Bengali literature.
That's beautiful. I see that happening for you, definitely. So, so I guess my next question with regards to this, and I hear what you're saying in terms of what and maybe I'm just ignorant of the kind of libraries specific to, the possible libraries, possible texts that are within these different regional languages. But is it also the case that we have a proportionally larger library of literature or possibilities, to be translated in the textual tradition of Sanskrit than in these other regional languages, such that there is an argument that we, that the emphasis on Sanskrit over these regional languages makes some sort of proportional sense? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I think it does make sense as a question, but
you're not sure that's true.
well, I mean, I don't think that one should study a language or one should study expressions in a language or the literature or the religious texts of a particular language because over and above another language, because there is more unstudied text in this and less in that. I don't think that's a very utilitarian argument for studying a subject. I think you should study a language and a literature and a culture because it fires your imagination, because you're curious.
Yeah.
It should be pure love. And it should be pure interest, not anything else. There is a vast amount of literature in the regional languages, in Tamil, in Bengali, and there will always be writing in that. But that doesn't mean that we should not study Sanskrit and just study those languages, those vernaculars. I'm interested in Bengali and Sanskrit. Bengali is my mother tongue, and I approach Sanskrit through the mother tongue. I think it's okay if I want to read in both and if I want to study in both.
If the passion is there.
If the passion is there. The passion is there, yes.
What do you, going back to the question about, being able to go to the source text, why do you think that that's so particularly important? Because it seems like there is less and less of that, right? I mean, that's one of the things you notice when you get to the program that I studied with you in, and also just seeing the amount of students. There are very few students studying Sanskrit. There are very few people, like proportionally to the rest of the academic community, really trying to get to a place where they actually can interact with these texts. So I guess the question is sort of one of how we even cultivate that passion to begin with, right? Because the passion for languages, you could say socially had a height, right? There, because it was emphasized, it was prioritized in sort of the academic culture to learn other languages. And yeah, you could make an argument that that was for some sort of imperialist agenda, colonialist agenda. But there was also just, in the background of that, a serious curiosity, a passion like the one you're describing that you have for Bengali and for Sanskrit. But in a state of our culture where we actually don't, less and less people have any passion whatsoever because they've never been introduced to something that would actually ignite that passion. How do you pedagogically, as a teacher, inspire that in your students?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways I do it, and I'm trying to do it now, is use the political argument.
Okay.
In that right now, Sanskrit is being seen as an RSS, a right-wing Hindu fundamentalist thing. This is the right time. Actually, this is the time when someone who's not right-wing, someone who's not, who doesn't have that kind of political agenda, should be studying Sanskrit to show that you can study Sanskrit unmotivated by any kind of political ideology. This is the time to do it and ask difficult questions that comes from reading, from studying the language, that should be asked. So there is that argument that this is the time really to study Sanskrit in the context of this rising intolerant attitude in India. This is the time to be studying Sanskrit in a way that isn't constrained by that intolerant attitude, in a way that's free. So it's important to be able to do, let's say, subversive Sanskrit studies, a Sanskrit studies that does not toe a right-wing politically right-wing constrained mode. It should be a kind of study now that is, that is courageous to ask questions that come up in a free mind. And that's what I tell students. And this is what gets them excited. So yeah, I don't know if I answered that.
No, you did. And I think I just found the title of this podcast, Subversive Sanskrit Studies with Bahani. I love that. And it brings up a question for me that's going to go to another one of our kind of political, slightly political or social questions.
We should create this thing here, actually, Jacob. We should create subversive.
Let's do it.
A workshop for subversive Sanskrit studies.
Yes.
Right here.
If you're interested, listeners, email jacob@embodiedphilosophy.com. Tell him you want to be a part of this Subversive Sanskrit Studies workshop. I'll see if there's some interest in that. Okay, one of the other criticisms of Sanskrit, and I love talking about this with others, with people who study Sanskrit, and obviously I do. But there is a sense in which the field is dominated by white men, straight white men. So I mean, I have one marginalized ticking box, but I'm still a white man in this field. So whether or not that makes me a part of the problem or not, who knows? But how does it? So I have two questions regarding this. Like, first of all, how has it been for you as a South Asian woman to be in a field dominated by white men? Has it been something that you've actively reflected upon, that you felt alienated by or affected by in some way? And then in the name of this sort of subversive Sanskrit studies, does a part of that also involve bringing other marginalized voices into this field?
Yeah, thank you. That is a brilliant question, and I think I have been thinking about this for consciously and unconsciously for the entirety of my Sanskrit journey. The first thing to say about this field is that it's very male dominated.
Yeah.
First, there are few women in the field, and it's not just in Western academia. Traditionally, Sanskrit is a subject. I mean, the study of Sanskrit has been the privilege of men.
Yeah.
Although, of course, there are some women who studied Sanskrit and who wrote Sanskrit texts, and you have examples of women philosophers in Upanishadic writings. You have citations of women poets in compendia of Sanskrit poetry. But these are few. On the whole, the study of Sanskrit has historically been the privilege of men. So going into Sanskrit, I was very conscious of the fact that I'm a woman stepping into a field of men, white men and brown men in general. And I was very conscious that the reason I was doing so was because throughout my life, the arbiters of authority, the arbiters of cultural authority, while I was growing up, were all men. I didn't have the freedom to interpret tradition without it being interpreted to me and for me by a man, or by a woman who echoed a man's viewpoint. So when I was going in to study Sanskrit, I was very conscious of the fact that I was interpreting this literature and thought world that was largely produced by men as a woman, and I'm making this radical choice. It was a choice that empowered me, because I didn't want to be dependent on those male voices of authority. So that was one aspect. As I went further in the field, I began to notice that, yes, it was not just male dominated, but it was also dominated by white men. And I think there is a particular way that white men view non-white women, especially non-white women from the East. There is a general stereotype, and it's not just in Sanskrit studies. I think it might be in academia, might be more widely outside academia as well. There's a general stereotype that women from the East are docile, are polite, are quiet, are submissive. And because of those characteristics, they are overlooked. I felt overlooked and marginalized as a South Asian woman in a field dominated by white male academics for a very long time. And so that forms a kind of, I guess, an anger that I'm gradually coming to terms with, and I'm fighting back against that viewpoint intellectually these days as well, because I'm working on a book on women in Sanskrit poetry, and largely conceptions of wild women and female transgression in this body of traditional literature that actually argues that instead of seeing a lot of these women in the way that they have and they are by the white male Sanskritist, which is that they are passive, unimportant, pretty, meek non-entities, that they're actually powerful, passionate, active, defiant women. And it is possible to read these women against that particular hegemonic white male academic view. And an example I use to fight back against that view is the example of Parvati in the Kumara Sambhava. Stop at that.
I love that. I can't wait to read that book. Well, I mean, I'm curious then, does because when you're talking about images of powerful women, of course, the first thing that sort of emerges for me are images that one finds, iconographic images one finds in the Śākta tradition. And, you know, I feel like a lot of what we're talking about sort of comes back, at least in terms of the religious study, to Shaktism, which has been a big formative field of study for you and seems to motivate a lot of what you do, because not only was your Heroic Shaktism, your first book, on obviously that very topic, but also interestingly for me, because I took it up as well, was you started the Shaktism track at Oxford in the MPhil in Classical Indian Religion, which was the program that I did that I studied with you in. And although it's sort of after you left, because for those that are listening, so the story went, she got a job at Lancaster and then left us after the first year. We didn't we didn't judge you for it. It was a totally valid decision,
so
but we missed you.
Come back to me. Come to me in Lancaster. Come back to me. Come join me.
I would love to.
Form a subversive Sanskrit group.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I'm just curious how. I suppose I'm trying to segue us into a little bit of that that passion and that pursuit of the study of Shaktism, and I'm curious why, because with what is important about studying Shaktism independently of Shaivism, right? Because a lot of times I think Shaktism gets sort of absorbed into a study of Shaivism because it's considered this sort of esoteric evolution or escalation of Shaiva philosophy or soteriology. But you really have, you know, are among, you know, many obviously academics and practitioners who really highlight and allow to stand as independent from that, the Śākta tradition. So can you talk a little bit about that? It's sort of a broad ranging question. But it seems like a perfect time to talk about it, since we're sort of discussing marginalized voices, and Shaktism seems like it's been a marginalized tradition until relatively recently.
Yes. So within the subcontinent, there has always been independent veneration of a goddess or many goddesses identified as a single supreme goddess. Areas of the subcontinent, such as Bengal, Nepal, South India, Rajasthan, are home to vibrant traditions of Śākta or goddess worship, in which it's the goddess in her singularity who is worshipped. So the entire idea that Śākta traditions are somehow only adjuncts to Shaivism or Vaishnavism does not tally with the lived reality of worship in the subcontinent presently, as well as historically. If you look at Śākta inscriptions, there are more than 240 inscriptions evincing devotion to a goddess, and a goddess who is exalted as a supreme, all-powerful deity, going back to the 2nd century AD. So I think that although Indians have known it for a very long time, it seems somehow within academia and within the Western academic discourse, it seems that it's important to show that Shaktism was a standalone tradition, because so much of the study of philosophical and conceptual sources has been from the Shaiva and the Vaishnava areas. So that's my answer, that I think Shaktism as an independent tradition has always been recognized by South Asians within South Asia. And also inscriptions can show it. I mean, one of the reasons that Shaktism became ever more popular was that goddess worship was incorporated into these other patriarchal traditions within Shaivism, within Vaishnavism, even within Jaina traditions, and of course the Buddhist tantric traditions. There are strong Śākta, that is to say, goddess worshipping traditions that were incorporated. So Shaktism is not only a standalone tradition, but it also permeates and pervades other classical traditions as well. So what was the second question, Jacob? Sorry.
I don't even remember. But that's okay. I have more.
I said something about Shaktism and feminism, was it? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess the question was related to this idea of how the I don't know, not even resuscitation, because, right, like you're saying, it's always already been a part of the lived experiences of people, you know, worshiping within these traditions, in both contemporarily and anciently, over centuries. And it's only within the academic study that it's been sort of subsumed within these other agendas, research agendas. So it seems that there is a kind of feminist argument to be made over focusing, obviously, on the elevation of the Shakta traditions. And there's a feminist reasoning behind why the Shakta traditions may have been not highlighted as the important traditions, or as central to, you know, the religious life of India.
Absolutely. I do think there's a feminist argument to be made in studying these traditions in their own right, rather than being, as you know, quote unquote, the sexier versions of Shaivism and Vaishnavism. And there is a further point about feminism that I actually wanted to make. And this is from my perspective as an Indian woman, that for South Asian women, Shakta traditions, the concepts and the tales about the goddess and practices about the goddess have been our homegrown native feminist traditions for centuries. Within these Śākta tales, we have models of female autonomy that Indian girls have found inspiring for centuries. So it's a kind of homegrown feminist tradition, which kind of which form templates of inspiring, emancipating Indian women. So that's something that I've been kind of thinking about lately as well, that Shaktism could even be thought of, or the way I experienced it really, is that it was the local feminist tradition.
That's a really unique way to think about it. I really love that, actually. Like the idea of the Shakta traditions as a homegrown feminist tradition. I feel like that's a rich area of research that hasn't really been explored so much, it seems, or that I've seen.
I think it's important to think about it this way because lately, of course, global feminisms are becoming very, very important within feminist scholarship. Writers from Islamic feminism, from Black feminism, are really contributing with perspectives that challenge assumptions within Western white feminism. And I think I mean, I certainly find the writings of Islamic feminists very, very inspiring. Writings of, say, Sabah Mahmood and Laila Abu Lugod, who argue that actually forms of piety, forms of women expressing and relishing their religious life, were in fact forms of self-expression and empowerment in many contexts. And I think that these kinds of alternative perspectives in feminism that bring in the viewpoint of non-Western cultures is really helpful now for us to consider Shaktism as a kind of feminist, as a kind of feminist in its ideology.
Yeah.
That here you have a central a notion of autonomous female and an image of autonomous female, of an autonomous femaleness that is both maternal and at the same time that is violent. So it's a really rich conception of female subjectivity that we find articulated here.
Yeah.
And when I have that in mind and I read tales and legends of the goddess, I actually see narratives about women's experiences lurking in the background. For example, in legends about the goddess Kali leaping out from Parvati's rejected black skin, the skin that she sloughed off her body because she wanted to be fair and white, I find in it a reflection of basically a tale about unwanted daughters, that the unwanted daughter is rejected from the mother's womb. And this unwanted daughter, who is Kali, grows up or becomes this ferocious and angry goddess. So if you look deeply within Śākta narratives, you will find feminist tales or tales about women's experiences. I'm going to leave it.
Yeah, almost like they're codified in these mythologies and these stories. And I really like what you're pointing out about the way in which they challenge obviously the notion of the maternal has a particular set of features, and violence certainly isn't included within it. So it challenges this binary thinking about what these concepts mean that are part and parcel of, like you said, kind of a white Western approach to feminism, wherein something like the maternal might be otherwise characterized differently. So it offers a different picture of these things in a way that is really fruitful. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually thinking about tales of women or tales of goddesses as narratives of women's experience and narratives that tell us about female subjectivity is something that I'm occupied with a lot these days. And I'm beginning to see that these tales express so much more. Sisterhood, for example. I mean, I was, looking at the description of Parvati's asceticism in chapter 5 of the great epic poem, the Kumar Sambhava. And in that description, Parvati is not alone. She's with her friends. And her friends accompany her on this journey of self-transformation. The and in this narrative, Parvati is using piety to express herself and to transform herself, to make herself independent of family, to make herself into a new and strong woman. So, and in that journey, her friends are an important part, play an important part. They're not hidden, they're there. And a lot of people have asked me when I'm reading this text, why isn't she alone? And I'm like, no, I mean, you know, she can't be alone. She's with her sisters, with her friends. They are multiple voices. All of these are voices of women, and Parvati somehow stands for women in collectivity. So this idea of a collective female self, a self that is in numbers, a self that is formed of different female experiences which all echo. I feel that emerges from a lot of this literature as well.
That's so interesting. So I'm going to ask you then, I wanted to ask you a question about the style of historic Shaktism, or rather the kind of methodological approach, which, you know, as you've already mentioned, you talked at the beginning about the relationship between religion and kingship, religion and kind of the state apparatus, for lack of a better term, which is a really important dimension of understanding. I think that when, you know, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are practitioners of various sorts. They're yoga practitioners, they're meditators, and insofar as they're interested in Indian philosophy or Indian religions, they're interested from, in some sense, a devotional standpoint. So in that world, there's a lot of people who have a lack of historical view, right? And sometimes, and there's a lot of, I think, criticism of this dehistoricization that happens, you know, within certain contemporary spiritual communities, whereby if they had actually engaged in a historical way, there would be different insights, and one could kind of tease out a little bit of some of the historical reasons for why some of these things emerged. So that's one dimension of thinking, right? The historical view. But there's also this, and I think actually we discussed this when you were teaching at Oxford, but because the book is so historical, and in some ways it feels a little bit like, you know, Sheldon Pollock is also a very historical thinker, and really, you know, very much focuses on kind of the relationship between these forms of these different royal patronages and connections with different state actors or governmental actors or imperial actors. But then there is this competing view that suggests that if we over-historicize, then we actually disempower the lived, because these religious traditions are always both contextual and also reaching beyond the contextual in their own self-understanding, right? They're reaching beyond towards a state of transcendent fulfillment that, you know, takes on a particular historical tonality in different contexts, but is sort of reaching towards something that it believes is perennial, right? That it is reaching towards some kind of religious experience that then takes on these different characteristics depending on the different context. So, and so there is, I think, a critical response to the historical mode, which I know you don't share this view purely and completely, but it's just something that I think comes up for somebody that might be reading this text. It's sort of like, well, how, when I'm historicizing something in a particular way, I end up feeling like it's no longer mine, right? In a sense, because it becomes something that has been taken out of sort of the lived voice of perennial spiritual experience, and sort of in almost a sense, I think Nietzsche made this point of the way in which historicization can actually deaden the life of a kind of spiritual trajectory, or I mean, he wouldn't have put it that way, but that's the way I'm putting it.
Yes.
So I don't know. I've just went kind of on a tangent with all of these things,
No,
but
I get you. There is
yeah,
this extreme
secularization.
secularization
Yeah.
of aspects of South Asian culture in which, like for example, kavya, Sanskrit poetry, is sometimes by some scholars read as something purely secular, but it's also the expression of religious piety. There are passionate devotional hymns which are written in ornate Sanskrit, so-called secular Sanskrit. So I think this division into secular and religious is the result of a rather kind of Western liberal attitude that sees religion, politics, literature all as separate little boxes and
Yeah.
divided up. Whereas in some parts of the world, it wasn't. They really bound it together. For example, political rituals, the Ashwamedha, the Rajasuya, the Navaratra, they were worship, acts of worship, in which there was a genuine connection between the self and the transcendent. But there were also aspects that empowered the ruler, empowered the entire state. So these two dimensions, the political and the sacred, the mundane and the sacred, overlapped. So you can't divide the two up really in considering some certain aspects of heritage. So that's my take on reading traditions historically, is that you've got to be mindful and conscious of their real, genuine importance to practitioners as practices of faith, while at the same time being aware of the various factors over time that have changed the form of worship. So you've got to be both. You've got to be aware of both aspects. You've got to take into account the fact that these rituals are deeply important for some even today. And at the same time, you've got to take into account that these rituals also, like any other thing, any other part of culture, has a history and a background.
Yeah.
I should also say that I am someone from South Asia. I am from a traditional Hindu household. I've grown up seeing and witnessing these traditions firsthand and in a very authentic way. I therefore feel that given that I'm an insider through and through, I have the right to study these traditions historically as well, which have been studied historically by others who were not part of the tradition.
Yeah.
So for centuries, rituals have been studied as curiosities, historical curiosities by mainly non-Western academic scholars, or they are appropriated as practice by Western academic scholars, or they're appropriated as practice by Westerners who are not part of the tradition. And as someone who comes from a family that's a family of freedom fighters who fought against colonial oppression, I see it as a way of taking back control of the narrative of my identity. So I feel that I do have a right to be historical about these things.
Yes.
And I feel that I know about these things. And I feel that I can be historical about these things because I know about these things as an insider.
Yeah. So you're bringing up a really interesting point, and I didn't even know that we would go here, but I'm glad that we are, because what I hear you saying is, sometimes the sort of the emic understanding or the insider view is often within religious studies um, defined as someone who is internal to the tradition, not necessarily by means of culture, but by means of practice and engagement. One who sort of imbibes and feels internal to the worldview and the philosophy of that tradition, and has adopted sort of the let's say the epistemologies that one does, whether it's ritual or meditation or some form of practice or ritual, to actually, I don't know, embody that tradition. And so what I hear you maybe suggesting, and I kind of want to hear what you think about this, is that and this is another thing that's been criticized, of course, by some academics, that, or just people, those who are in that this is that to be an insider of the tradition, one must be of the culture, like and that because you were from India, you're from Bengali, and you were internal to these traditions. Like when I hear you say you're an insider, that seems defined by this cultural specificity, this cultural location, right? And and the kind of immersion that you were, and in the way in which you embody it by means of being raised in it. So I guess my question is, do you think that it's not possible, like Christianity, other religions, people convert to these traditions? How do you see Hinduism with regards to that? Can someone become an insider by means of their own adoption of these worldview and practices, or does one have to be a person raised within these traditions in order to be an insider?
Oh my God, that is such a difficult question, and it's opening such a minefield. Because while you say that, I'm very much aware that part of the arguments that Hindu nationalists use is that, knowers of the tradition are simply born into the tradition. So you've got
Yeah.
that kind of view. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking of, say, African philosophers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who really does make this argument in Decolonizing the Mind, and in a very radical way, that it's only someone who is born Black African who has the right and the power to express a viewpoint about their traditions, because they know the traditions the best. And that argument is made as a kind of reclamation of lost identity. So you've got two things going on here on either side, and I don't know what the right answer is. I think a strong part of me, which is, a large part of me, which is powerfully influenced by Black decolonization philosophies, by Black decolonialist thinkers, does think that you need to be from inside the tradition to really understand it. You need to be from the culture to really understand it. But another part of me also is critical, self-critical, and says that, no, actually you're thinking like an RSS, a Hindu nationalist person, to say that if you can only understand a culture best if you're born into it. So I'm actually not quite sure. I think for the time being, because we are in a moment in history where post-colonial societies such as India are still finding their identity and still reclaiming that lost identity, which has basically been taken away. And there's trauma that we have to go through, generational trauma.
Yeah.
That part of me says that at this point of time, I need to make a commitment to the political stance that one needs to be from within the culture to understand it well, so that one can evaluate it, reevaluate it, and thereby come up with a new post-colonial identity, South Asian identity. but at the same time, I'm not a Hindu fundamentalist.
Yeah. No, I think I really
You
appreciate the
know,
honesty about this, because
I
I think
taught Islamic kingship today, and you know the joys and wonders of the aesthetic marvels of South Asian Islam was the topic of the day today in the classroom. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where I stand on that, Jacob. I think it's a really difficult question, and we can go on and on talking about it.
yeah, I mean, I really appreciate your honesty about it. And I think it just is one of those questions that, to be honest with yourself, if you're a careful thinker, you end up in a little bit of a paradox, because
Yeah.
it, on the one hand, I mean, I'm honest about the fact that I practice within a meditative tradition that derives from Śākta Shaiva Tantra, and I feel connected, and that I would say that I'm an insider to that tradition insofar as I am engaged with, like, I am an insider to the worldview in which the soteriological technologies make sense, right? I am, but at the same time, I was not raised in India. I do not come, from a background where I was immersed in that. And I fully acknowledge that there is an argument to the fact that by privileging too many voices within the conversation who were not raised in India, and then having that take on, like, this is what Shaivism is, or this is what Shaktism is, and those people did not have the experience of being raised within the cultural framework of India, that it will be kind of painting a picture of that tradition that is of a different flavor. And so
I think that's the key thing that you mentioned, that it's a different flavor, as long as it's like, it's like the kind of shakshuka that I make at home. I've got it out from some recipe book. It's not really the traditional, wonderful, glorious shakshuka that someone from a deep Turkish household will cook for me. I'm aware of it. As long as I think one is aware that there are roots and origins. That's where history is important, because it tells you about the roots and origins of that particular cultural practice, that we are aware of that journey. And it's like sometimes, when you forget the roots, you forget the kind of the trauma that was. Sometimes there are histories of colonialism and slavery and things like that, and all these practices that have gone from one culture to another that people forget. I think the key thing here is to be aware of the story and history of that tradition, where it comes from. It's very important to know where it comes from, because the danger is that when when memory of where it comes from is lost, that's when you take away the voice of the original tradition.
Yeah.
And the power of the original tradition. That's where you're appropriating. That's that's what we call cultural appropriation, where you don't recognize, you don't value the place where that tradition started, and the reasons why it started, and the people amongst whom it started. So knowledge, it comes down to knowledge and awareness, being mindful and respectful, and valuing the place where something comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
That's my answer.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. So speaking of kind of the formative experiences that are sort of part and parcel of how you relate to Sanskrit, and also to the traditions of Shaktism that you feel internal to, one of the things that I just loved about you from the beginning was your chanting, your singing during your book release, which I thought, speaking of radical, subversive Sanskrit practices, I'm like, this is not subversive, right? This is quite a traditional way of engaging with Sanskrit. As anybody who knows even a little bit about Sanskrit knows that there is an incredible vibratory tradition of oral recitation, and when I one of the things that I'm kind of very passionate about is the notion of and the position of the scholar practitioner, and that in my approach to it has to do more of the kind of embodied epistemologies that I feel are particular to studying something like any yoga tradition, right? You're not going to be able to understand the sort of concepts of yogic experience if you are not engaging with the
Exactly.
the embodied epistemologies. So like, to me, it's almost that's another way I feel like this cultural appropriation argument can go, that I feel particularly passionate about, is that that what is happening, particularly in academia, but also to a certain extent, they take on it happens in different ways in the modern yoga community and in academia. In academia, they're engaged from this quote unquote objective standpoint, and the sort of embodied practices or rituals that would help one to kind of conceptualize in a non-discursive way the teachings or the concepts of those traditions. They're not engaged with. They don't. Academics aren't meditating generally. They're not chanting, right? They're not doing these things that are sort of perhaps one way we can understand a dimension of understanding these traditions.
Of course.
And then in the yoga tradition, they are, from a popular standpoint, they are anesthetizing the yoga practice from its soteriological component, right? They are kind of extracting the hatha yoga, right, the physical practices, from the spiritual context from which they derive, and therefore not actually giving the yoga an opportunity to do what it's designed to do, which is to help you experience some sort of, various forms of transcendent states, depending on which tradition you're looking at. So then coming back to your approach, I sort of saw you as being a kind of kindred spirit in this way, because the fact that you chose to, to go a little further in what would have, in an academic environment where people are not, most of those academics in that room are not going to go and release their book and chant or sing. And I loved that you did that, because it just showed a kind of sensitivity and a vulnerability and creativity at your core as an academic, but also your, a subversive way that actually is quite traditional of presenting Sanskrit to an academic audience while also staying connected to the practice of the recitation of Sanskrit. So that's a lot of talking. So yeah, I'm just curious what you think about that and how you see your relationship with Sanskrit from a musical, I don't know if you see it as devotional, perspective, how you see that playing into all the things that we've been talking about in terms of your relationship with Sanskrit as an academic and as a thinker.
Well, before I give my answer, I should mention to your audience that I don't know if your audience knows that, Jacob, you are a trained dancer and singer as well.
I wouldn't call myself a trained dancer, but I was originally in musical theater, so I had to do all of that, and singing was kind of my first love. So that's also, yes, you're right. The context of this is also that hearing you sing also, of course, captures my own. And I think maybe that was also what appealed to me, is I was like, someone who can combine the passions to sing and to focus on this path of study, and integrate it in such a beautiful way. And yeah, that was also what appealed to me as well, was kind of that those two things being brought together.
So you understand the joy of art, the joy of performance, the joy and nerves of performance. just that energy that happens when you're performing, that moment where you feel you're lifted out of this space and there's something magical that's happening right now, almost like witchcraft. I think you understand that. And you're speaking to someone who is a frustrated singer. I trained in Indian classical music for a very, very long time. In fact, my first memory is of my mother singing. She has a beautiful voice, and she was trained in the songs of Tagore. I am from a Bengali household, and it's almost de rigueur for any Bengali child to be trained in the songs of Tagore. My mom not just trained in it, she loves singing it, and she's a beautiful voice. So my first memory is lying on her lap, looking up at her face, and her singing, accompanied by the tanpura. And from that time on, music has been very close to my heart. It runs in the family. I've grown up surrounded by people who love music, family friends who are musicians. Music was the topic of the day. So I think deep down, I am first a singer and then an academic. I think I'm an accidental academic.
Oh my God, that resonates with me so much.
I mean, so much of the natural power of music, which is instinctive. I feel like Sanskrit, I learned it and I had to struggle with it, but I was just born with music. It was a gift. And if one's talking about transcendence, well, I'm blessed that in my otherwise mundane life, that's a touch of transcendence. And I'm grateful for it, that there is that music is the touch of transcendence in my life. And in a way, singing Sanskrit poetry in Indian ragas is a way to reconnect with that transcendence, really. I don't think of it as doing something traditional. In fact, I'm probably not chanting it according to the traditional way. I compose melodies to particular ragas. That also keeps up my practice and knowledge of the ragas. And I take particular pieces of Sanskrit poetry that I feel will just be totally different if it was experienced as music. And I set it to music and I sing it, and hopefully that gives a better experience of the poem. So yeah, it's a way for me to keep in touch with a powerful spiritual dimension in me that I cannot explain, that I was blessed with, and I'm grateful that I was blessed with it. And whenever I die, I want to die with a song on my lips.
That's so beautiful. What an incredible note to end on as well. I'm so glad we ended up here. I'm so glad I asked you that, because I really do feel, I mean, I'm actually in this place of a lot of shifts have happened recently for me. And I started studying with a voice teacher again. And I was kind of kicked out of a musical theater program, which is a early adult trauma that is basically set me on the path that I'm on now. And I feel like I'm also an accidental academic, or I'm on that path of becoming an accidental academic. And there's always kind of music in the background that pulls me toward it. And I feel like there is this sort of, journey in which I'm trying to integrate these two aspects of myself. And I love that you mentioned music as a reaching towards the transcendent, or as a spiritual practice, because I really feel that, just making a kind of perhaps polemical or philosophical point, that music is already spiritual. And the only reason that we experience it as mundane is because we've forgotten, right? It's sort of this pratyabhijna, like if we could just recognize that it is already a spiritual practice, then, it's only in our culture that we have kind of put it in this category of entertainment. Yeah. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think music is an easy way into the spiritual for so many, because it's sort of that last kind of universal thing that we all share. I mean, it's hard
It's
to find people
art.
that don't like music.
Yeah, it's art, it's creativity, it's Shakti, isn't it?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been such a lovely conversation, Bahani, and
Thank you, Jacob.
I'm
Thank
so glad
you.
that we went on for a little longer than I usually do, but it
Of
felt
course.
really lovely
I hope
to
your
chat with
viewers
you.
were not bored.
What's that?
I hope your viewers were not bored.
Oh, no, no. We went into so many interesting areas, and I didn't even touch on classical Sanskrit tragedy, but maybe next time. You'll have to come when you're in London next time. Let me know, and we
I
should have
will.
a coffee and catch up. I would love to see you in person after so
And
long.
you've got to tell me about your voice coach.
I will do, yes. So is there anything, just again, I've been speaking to Bihani Sarkar. She is the author of 2 books, right? Just 2. Heroic Shaktism. I have both of them here. Heroic Shaktism, The Cult of Durga in Ancient Indian Kingship, which is just as it sounds, a investigation of the cult of Durga in ancient Indian kingship, a very interesting historical perspective, and I definitely recommend it if you are a student or an interested reader of Shaktism. And then the second book, which I was at the book release party for, and I'm very happy to say what we were speaking of, Bahani, when Bahani was singing at the book release, it was for the book Classical Sanskrit Tragedy, The Concept of Suffering and Pathos in Medieval India. And this was actually the first one I read. Really super interesting, because I love the kind of cross-cultural emphasis of it, the discussion of kind of, I mean, obviously you were focused on Sanskrit, but the concept of tragedy being sort of monopolized in some sense by the Western tradition, thinking that it has some sort of exclusive right over that term. And from what I understand, the point of the book really was to illustrate the way in which we find tragedy represented in Sanskrit literature. So those 2 books, get them at your local bookstore or on Amazon. I believe you can find them there. And is there anything else that you're working on, Bahani, in terms of book projects you want to share, so that when people listen to this, if it's in the future, they can look for that as well?
Well, I'm working on a book called Wild Women and Goddesses in Ancient Sanskrit Poetry and Mythology. So
That
there'll
sounds
be
fantastic.
a lot of wild women there.
I'm sure there's lots of people who will relate to that. So check out.
I hope so.
I'll be getting that book myself. So yeah, look for Wild Women if it's in November of 2023 when this is being interviewed. When do you have a date around when it might be coming out?
2025.
Okay, so it's a
still
little
time.
ways away.
I'm still
All right.
working on it.
Still working on it. All right. Well, if you're listening to this in 2025, look for Wild Women by Bihani Sarkar. And otherwise, it's been fantastic, and I hope to
Thank
see
you,
you very
Jacob.
soon.
It's been such a pleasure, and I'm sending you a big warm hug from my end, and hope you flourish and sing.